Welcome, everyone, to those who are in person at SAR, to those who are with me on Zoom. Excited to be learning with you, teaching with you as part of SAR's Yemei Iyun. And what we're going to do today is that I'm going to break the cardinal rule of that every rabbi is supposed to follow no matter what. And that is I'm going to talk about politics, right? Rabbis, right? I used to be a synagogue rabbi for about a decade before we moved to Israel. Right, like the one thing you know is if the rabbi gets up on the bima on Shabbat morning and the first words out of his mouth when he gives the drasha implies it's going to be a politically oriented drasha, I would say at least 99% of the people who are present in the synagogue that morning kind of clench, right? Because what they know is what's coming is that when rabbis speak about politics, it's usually the case that a significant number of people are going to be upset. And I know what that experience is like from both ends. But what we're going to actually look at in this session is a fascinating historical development, one might say, where there are circumstances in which the Torah inexorably influences modern political thought in ways that we often don't even realize. And when that happens, and when the Torah in some ways also critiques modern political formulations centuries, thousands of years before they ever came into being, I think that's something that is worth really looking at closely. So we are going to get into politics, but as we're going to see, some of the greatest modern thinkers of political thought brought the Torah directly into it, and that the issues that they dealt with, the issues that Torah dealt with, are the same exact issues that we find ourselves dealing with today. And the lens through which we're going to explore the question is this prohibition that appears in the Torah that Moshe says to the Jewish people, that is a desire the Jewish people have, even though they keep being told it's not an option, and that is that desire to return to Egypt. If you're familiar with the Exodus narrative, right, when the Jewish people finally leave Egypt with Moshe after all the plagues, they eventually find themselves at the Red Sea with the waters in front of them and Pharaoh's armies at their backs. They are in the proverbial, between a rock and a hard place. And in that moment, right, the people famously turn to Moshe and they say, "Why did you take us out here to die? Were there not enough graves for us in Egypt?" Right, with the implication being that like life was better for us in Egypt, like you've just only made things worse for us. And in that moment, right before they cross the Red Sea, right after the water split, Moshe says to the people, "This is the last time you're going to see Pharaoh in Egypt ever again." Right? This is it. There's no turning back. However, we know as you continue to read the Exodus narrative, it seems that no matter what happens to the Jewish people, whatever obstacles they overcome, whatever miracles God makes happen, the Jewish people keep wanting to go back to Egypt. And it seems to be this is sort of a hidden unconscious desire of the people. And it's a desire that is perhaps so present that it has to be addressed even after the Jewish people finally make it into the land of Israel. So the notion that the Jewish people are not supposed to return to Egypt actually becomes formulated as a halachic principle. It's one of the 613 mitzvot, which basically states that you're not allowed to return to Egypt. You're not allowed to live there in any kind of fixed fashion. So let me share the screen. Everybody can see the shared screen? Okay, great. So what I want to begin with is just a brief halachic analysis of this question of returning back to Egypt and what's going on there and how we're going to understand it. And as we peel back the layers, particularly by doing some close readings in Tanakh, we'll hopefully have a better sense of what this prohibition is all about. Because what we're going to see is that this prohibition is not so much a question of geography, but a question of the political structure, the political society that Israel is going to shape for itself in the land of Israel. So what I have here is a comment of the Ritba, one of the Rishonim, Sephardi Rishonim. And he basically, the reason I chose him is he lays out a variety of positions of how this prohibition is to be understood. Because the first thing that anybody who discovers that there's a prohibition of Jews returning to Egypt, living in Egypt, has to confront is the fact for a large portion of the last 2,000 years, Jews have lived in Egypt. right? Not only have Jews lived in Egypt, right? Some of the greatest rabbis in Jewish history lived in Egypt, right? The Rambam himself, Maimonides, right? He has to write, right, in the 613 mitzvot, in the Sefer mitzvot, right? A Jew cannot return to Egypt, a Jew cannot live to Egypt. He writes it again in the Mishnah Torah, and yet he spends his whole life there. And the Rambam does not offer, I'll just note, a full-throated halachic defense for why he's able to do this. It's not that we have a long tshuva of the Rambam explaining this. So it's actually something that later authorities have to kind of explain, well, what's going on here? How do we understand this? So here's what the Ritba says, and we'll unpack it. He says, Perush to Afagav Tiktiv, as it says, and again, this is a reference to Moshe's line to the Jewish people that they're never going to see Pharaoh again, they're never going to see Egypt again. Lo tosifun l'shuv b'derech hazeh od. You shall never again come back this way to Egypt. Kvar pershu b'sifrei lagur sham iyat hachozer val ata chozer b'schora v'lichvosh et haaretz. Right. What the Sifrei already argues, the Midrash Halacha, is that it's not that you can't ever step foot within the boundaries of Egypt. It's just that you can't dwell there. But if you need to go back because you have business there, or if the Jews are actually going to go back and conquer Egypt, right, that would actually be permissible, right? You can go back for business, you can go back to conquer it. You just can't live there in any kind of permanent fashion. But of course, the Ritba knows the problem that we all know. Omiha tmiha milta, right? This doesn't make sense, though. We're still stuck. Kagona Rambam, right? If you only have permission to be there for business temporarily, that kind of thing, how is it that Maimonides and generations of Jews lived in almost a permanent sense in Egypt? And also many other great rabbis. V'yesh omrim, shotana yarot kvar nitbalbalu v'nechravu ve'elu ayarot achirot hein shenit yashvu achareken. Right, so there's a very interesting answer that's presented here, which is the reason that Jews can dwell in Egypt, even the Rambam himself, is because the cities they dwell in have no connections to the historical cities of ancient Egypt where the Jews were enslaved. It's a very interesting idea. It's right, even though we're still in Egypt, basically the position is saying it's not the same Egypt. It's like a different place entirely. And therefore, Jews are able to be there. And I think that position is important because as we're going to see, what I want to argue is that to a certain extent, Egypt is, I don't want to say a state of mind, but it's a set of political arrangements, right? It's a way a society is structured and functions. Therefore, one can physically be in Egypt, but not be violating the prohibition, which is about, again, the way the society actually structures itself. And the another Rishon actually argues the only prohibition only exists if you go from the land of Israel to Egypt, right? If you want to go from America to Egypt or France to Egypt or Africa to Egypt and live there, you're fine. The problem is when you go from Eretz Israel to Egypt, which again is saying something I think significant, because what it's getting at is the problem is not so much Egypt per se, it's the sliding back, right, from the way Jewish life is envisioned in the land of Israel, where God, at least in the Torah, wants the Jewish people to be, and the concern, the fear that they're going to slide back into what Egypt is, where they came from, and all the political, ethical, spiritual problems that come along with that, right? It's the descent from Israel to Egypt that's a problem, not just going to Egypt in itself. And he continues here. He says, basically that the prohibition only applies when the Jewish people are living in the land of Israel. Again, the concern is when Egypt is the alternative to Israel. But now when all the Jewish people are in exile, right, Egypt's just another place of exile. It doesn't have any special status. Right, and the only concern is perhaps leaving the land of Israel itself. So what you see here in the Ritba is a whole array of opinions trying to grapple with this question of why is it that Jews can't return to Egypt? And I think what they're pointing at, as I keep saying, is that it's not so much about the geography of Egypt, it's something much deeper about what Egypt represents, and the concern that Jewish life in Israel always has this chance of sliding back into Egypt. And that's what we have to be on guard for. And again, if we were to ask ourselves what's so problematic about Egypt, right? Sefer HaChinuch here, another medieval authority, basically says, I think what we would all say, right? The problem of Egypt, right, is that it's a bad place, right? Egypt's a bad place, and you shouldn't go back to Egypt because you'll be influenced in negative ways. That's what he says. He says, "Lefisha anse Mitzrayim ra'im v'chataim." Right? They're wicked and they're sinful. That's why you can't be there. Va'el Baruch Hu hotzianu misham v'ga'alanu b'chasdav mi'adam l'zchutenu l'lechet b'darkei ha'emet v'ratzah b'tuvo ha'gadol aleinu l'bilti nashuv odli tamei b'tocham. Right? God rescued us. God saved us by His grace, and He doesn't want us to go back there and to be immersed in that kind of place. Kadosh lo nilmad sifotehem, that we're not going to learn from all their ways. V'lo nilech b'darkechem, right? We're not going to go in their paths that are really, despicable in the Torah's eyes. Now, you could argue that, again, Egypt's a wicked place. Jews shouldn't go to Egypt, so they shouldn't learn from those kinds of ways. But as we know from the Torah's perspective, there's lots of wicked places, right? So what makes Egypt so significant? And the answer seems also to be that the Jews have this sort of problematic relationship to Egypt, right? Egypt is the place of our suffering, but Egypt is the place that, even though God has taken us out of there, that we can't seem to quite escape, right? Like you can almost think of it like the addict, the drug addict who has sort of maybe beaten the addiction, right? But the worst thing they can do is go back to those places where they used to, get high, so to speak, because the associations of that environment can have such a profoundly negative effect on it. Something about Egypt that's a real temptation and a real problem for the Jewish people. And as we're going to see, it's, again, not the geography of Egypt. The temptation of Egypt, the problematics of Egypt are going to follow the Jewish people all the way to the promised land. And that is going to be the dilemma that the Torah, I would argue, is really, really trying to address here in this question of not returning to Egypt. Right. So to better get a sense of, again, what's going on here, and the fact that the Egypt that we're talking about, as I said, can just as easily be found, I would say, in Israel itself, we have to look at the verses that outline this actual prohibition of returning to Egypt. It only appears in one place, specifically regarding the laws of the king. And it's very interesting because when you see it appear here in the laws of the king, it's kind of strange. You wouldn't think that the prohibition of returning to Egypt should have anything to do with this. Right? We would imagine it appears in some list of mitzvot that Moshe gives over, where he says, "Oh, and by the way, you should never go back to Egypt. That's a bad place." Right? We left there never to return. Right? The fact that it appears only as an explicit prohibition in the laws of the king is a bit surprising to us. And I think because of that, we have to look very closely as what is it doing here? What's going on? So these laws appear in Parshat Shoftim. It's only, whatever it is, 7 verses about the laws of the king in Parshat Shoftim. But again, you're probably familiar with this. I'll just briefly read them just to remind ourselves how the Torah understands the role of the king. It says here, I'll just read the English. If after you have entered the land that your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by your God. Right. So again, without getting into a detailed analysis of these verses, what they make clear is that this idea of having a king is not just necessarily the ideal that is laid out by God. That's what God wants. That's what the ideal society looks like. Right? There's already a certain tentativeness in these verses, because the verses open up by saying that who's going to really sort of want the king initially? It's going to be the people themselves, right? Already here, we're seeing that the desire for a king is more bottom up than top down. And that specifically the desire for a king already here is about the Jews comparing themselves to others. Everybody else has a king. Why can't we have a king, right? There's always, if you're a parent, you can almost hear there's something sort of childish in that. But at the same time, there's something very powerful for the people, right? They feel incomplete if they do not have a king. And what these verses make clear is that they can, or maybe even should, appoint a king for themselves. What the verses also make clear is that that king is going to, on some level, be chosen by God, right? Which means that it's again, God's legitimizing it. It's part of God's plan. Be sure to set a king over yourself, one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you who is not your kin. I mean, it's got to be a Jew. It can't be somebody who's not Jewish. Right? That's the opening. So we have a king, but it's really the people who want it, but God's going to allow it. God will appoint it. The next couple of verses focus immediately on the sort of limitations on the king's power. And what's interesting is, again, we introduced the idea of a king. We haven't even really said, the Torah at least, why a king is important. Why is this something we want? What is the positive role it's going to do? Why this is necessary? If you look at Parshat Shoftim, it lays out the prophets, it lays out the Shoftim, right? And it's very clear the broader societal role that they function under. With a king, it's just sort of like, well, the people want this, so we're going to do that, right? Again, it's not like it presents it in some kind of comprehensive way that makes clear why this is so important. And already it immediately shifts into limiting the king's power. And as I think we all know, the Torah is kind of obsessed, both here and elsewhere, with limiting the king's power. So what are we told? Verse 16, moreover, when it comes to the king, he shall not keep many horses. And now we get the prohibition, or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since God has warned you, you must not go back that way again. So what's interesting here is we're told the king can't have too many horses. And then almost it adds, by the way, right, the concern might be that you'll go back to Egypt to get the king's horses and you can't go back to Egypt. Right? It's very derech agav, as we say in Hebrew. It's very like matter of fact, by the way, incidental to the main point here. But it does reiterate this notion that, again, you're not supposed to be in Egypt, but it's specifically tied to the concern of the king having too many horses and you're going back to Egypt. Egypt apparently was known for its great, great horses. Right, that's the first limit on the king's authority. The second limit on the king's authority is in verse 17, he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. Right, he can't have too many wives, that's another limitation, and he can't have too much wealth. Right, again, wealth presumably being associated with power, though we'll see that wealth and wives and horses potentially represent different dimensions of the king's power. And then we get the famous teaching in the next couple of verses about the idea that the king actually has his own Sefer Torah. Right? The king writes his own Sefer Torah. The king carries around that personal Sefer Torah everywhere they go. Right? This is what it says here: when he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching of the Torah written for him on a scroll by the priests. Let it remain with him and let him read it in it all his life, so that he may learn to revere his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily towards his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So what the Torah is ending with here with the laws of the king is that the king has his own Sefer Torah. And why does the king have to carry around his own Sefer Torah? The whole point being because the king is being held accountable to the laws in the Sefer Torah. It's like very, very clear. That's the point, right? The king has to have that Torah, maybe more so than everybody else, because there's a concern that maybe the king more than anybody else is going to do what, right? Is going to break the laws in the Sefer Torah. That's why he's got to be the one to carry it around, right? The king, traditionally, again, if we think about medieval conception of kings, but certainly this was true in the ancient Near East as well, right? The king is seen typically as being above the law. Right, that's the role of the king, and we'll see this particularly with Pharaoh, and it was true in Mesopotamia as well. Right, the king is above the law, and what the Torah is making, abundantly clear is the king is not above the law. Literally, the king is below the law. That's why the king has to carry the Torah. Right, it's a reminder that they are subject to the laws of the Torah, to God's sovereignty. So when you look at these verses again, right, there's a hesitancy about the king. And there's a sense of the fundamental need to limit his authority. And there's a concern, right, about the king having too many horses might take the people back to Egypt. So let me just throw it out there. I mean, I'm happy to hear of your thoughts. When we talk about the horses, the wives, and the material wealth, right, the silver and gold, what different dimensions of the king's power might those things represent? Does anybody have any ideas? Right, you can almost imagine, and I mean, again, we want to be political thinkers, right? Like how the president has different forms of authority in different areas, right? You can almost imagine here these are representing different domains of the king's authority as well. And that's why they have to be limited in some sense. Any thoughts? We got somebody to check. Military, political, and economic, right? So if I map it on here, military is the horses. Particularly as we're going to see, the horses enable you to have chariots. The wives, I assume, are political because, again, if you know anything about Tanakh, right, the king marries wives as a way of forming political alliances, right? King marries this wife, who's the daughter of this political leader, right? It happens all sorts of directions. So if you're limiting the wives, you're limiting the ability for the king to expand their political power through alliances. And then, of course, the limit on gold and silver is a limit on material wealth. So I see another comment here. Alana notes private and public spheres. Do you want to just explain that a little bit more, Alana, how you see that playing out here?
Yeah, I mean, private would be the wives. I mean, it's kind of like everything is under scrutiny. The way that he comes out in public is under scrutiny and is limited, and the way that he can behave in private is also under scrutiny.
Good, right? We could imagine an attempt by the king to sort of amass private power or private excess. And the Torah is being very clear that all dimensions of the king's life are being monitored on some level, right? It's not like, well, we limit him in public, but who knows what he's doing behind the scenes, right? That this is also accounting for that as well. So what I want to note here, particularly about the horses, because that's where this line about not returning to Egypt appears. The Abarbanel makes just a sort of passing comments as part of a larger analysis. And again, if you know anything about the Abarbanel, you know he doesn't like kings, right? He really doesn't like the monarchy because he's seen how it can be, so profoundly oppressive. But here's what he notes here. He says, "Aval kivenat hakatuv shamelech lo yebel susi." My Torah says can't have too many horses. Me'artzo, me'yeter artzot, either horses from his land or horses from other lands. V'lo yivtach al rechavo ki ravu. Right. The concern is that the king is going to rely on his military strength, right? Horses enable chariots, essentially, right? If he has too many horses, he's going to become stronger militarily, and he's going to be able to rely solely on his own military might. Right? And the problem is that the king, with the excess of military power, is going to be able to rely on himself, his own might, as opposed to being dependent on God. And also there's the secondary concern, right, that if you can go back to Egypt to get horses, right, that there's a concern that Israel may look the king to rely on Egyptian military might. Remember, Israel is a minor country between two empires, essentially, between Egypt and, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, right? Israel's a small, tiny country. It doesn't have much might. So the temptation with Israel is always to try to side with one or the other, Babylonia or Egypt. And here there's a particular temptation of being reliant on Egypt, right? Because the Jews, more than anybody else, know how powerful Egypt is. And that's why the Torah says you can't go back to Egypt, because there's a concern that you're going to become dependent on their power or want to sort of hide under their military power. Right? That you're going to essentially want to ask Egypt for help. And we see examples of that, obviously, in Tanakh. So what I want to just pick up on with the Abarbanel is that the concern here is that if you have enough horses, you have enough military might, you don't need to be dependent on God. Or you can turn to Egypt and their power, and you don't need to be dependent on God. And again, what we're going to see, and I think this is important to understand, what makes Egypt fundamentally different from whatever the Jewish society is supposed to look like in Israel is this question of strength and who you depend on at the end of the day. Right? What makes Egypt is that the status of the sovereign of Pharaoh is that they are the all-powerful monarch. They are literally the God king. And that means you put your faith, your trust in them. Right? They have total control, right? In Israel, the Jews have a king, but the king ain't really in charge, right? God is the true sovereign of the Jewish people. And the whole concern seems to be, well, we can't let the king get too powerful, because if the king gets too powerful, right, we are basically recreating the circumstances of Egypt, right? That is why specifically, right, the king's having too many horses is going to lead us to return back to Egypt. And that's what I want to focus on, is that what the Torah really is concerned about is that once you have a king, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump until you have a pharaoh. And as we're going to see, this is not just the Torah's perspective. This is actually becomes the way that modern political thinkers draw on the Torah to understand the foundation of modern notions of sovereignty. And in many ways, the fears that we have of the way authoritarians can take over democracies is exactly the same sort of fears that the Torah is fighting against when it's saying you can't go back to Egypt, that we're trying to do something fundamentally different. Part of where this really starts to get developed is when you look at the discussion about the king in Sefer Shmuel. Right? This is the other famous discussion that complements the laws of the king in Devarim, the discussion in Sefer Shmuel, in which the Jewish people come to Shmuel and basically say, we want a king, right? We want a king. We want to be like everybody else. We want a king who will judge us, particularly lead us in military pursuits. Now, if you're familiar with this narrative, right, you know that Shmuel immediately gets upset when the people come to him and say that they want a king. And what we have to look closely at is God's response to Shmuel, because it is profoundly telling, right? If you look here in verse 7, it says, and the Lord said to Shmuel, God says to Shmuel, I know this is bothering you, but you got to listen to the people. Hearken unto the voice of the people and all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not be king over them. Meaning, Shmuel, don't think they're rejecting your authority as prophet, right? Like as shofet, right? They're actually rejecting me as their king. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even until this day, and that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Right? And what God is noting here to Shmuel is that this moment in which the Jewish people want a king is just another step in a long line of betrayals in which the Jewish people turn away from God, where we keep replacing God with alternatives, right? The most obvious, narrative that's being sort of implied here is the golden calf, right? Every moment God establishes God's sovereignty and the people accept it, right? It's just a matter of time to the people start saying, you know what, God's too much as a sovereign. We need an alternative that we can imbue with the sovereignty that we can relate to. That's going to be, easier for us. And essentially, what God is saying here is, we're going to give him a king. It's a problem for me because the concern is that it may replace me, right? The concern is that king may actually become sort of an idolatrous figure for the people, but God is still, taking the risk here. We can ask ourselves why God takes the risk. The answer may be simply because he knows that there's simply no other alternative for the people at this time, but it's a risk. In other words, you can't have a king without risking idolatry. That's what God is telling them. But we're going to let it happen with the hope that the Torah presents controls, limitations that won't turn that into the reality. But nonetheless, God tells Shmuel, I still want you to warn the people about everything that's going to happen to them when you have a king, right? Because the fear is once you have a king, right, you run the risk of the king abusing their authority. And that's exactly what Shmuel tries to convey to the people, right? At the end of the day, you want a king, right? But you're going to find out what a king really means. And Shmuel goes on to list all the ways in which the king is going to oppress the people and abuse his authority. But what's interesting is that when you look closely at these examples, you start to realize that on the one hand, they reference things that will happen later on in Nevi'im, right? Later narratives about Shaul and David and others. You see how some of those kings abuse their power, and it seems as if Shmuel is foretelling that. But at the same time, when you look at these examples closely, we know another place where the king did all of these things and more. So let's read them and you'll see. And Shmuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked him of a king. And he said, this will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. First, he will take your sons and appoint them unto him for his chariots and to be his horsemen, and they shall run before his chariots. Right? King's going to take your men and he's going to make them your soldiers. And he's particularly going to use them to man your chariots. Right? So for the moment, I just want to note here, again, the word that keeps repeating is this notion of chariots. That's what we'll note for now. The king's military power, his chariots, by taking your men. The next abuse, we're told, is that he will appoint these, sons of yours that he takes to be captains of thousands, captains of 50s, and to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war the instruments of his chariots. They're going to become his soldiers. They're going to become his captains, but they're also going to become the people who work the ground, plow the ground, and harvest. The next abuse, right? He'll take your daughters to be his perfumers and to be cooks and to be bakers. He'll take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He'll take your men servants, your maid servants, and your goodliest young men and your asses and put them to his work. Right. So what I'll note here, and I think this will become clear, especially with the next verse, is that there also, in addition to this foretelling abuses of the Jewish kings that will to come, what we also see here are hints of exactly what Pharaoh does in Egypt. Right. So let's think this through for a moment. Right. The reference of chariots, the king is going to take your men and have chariots. Well, one of the things we know about Pharaoh is that his might is directly associated with his chariots. Right. That's the image that appears again and again in regards to Pharaoh. Right. Again, the chariot is the sign of military strength. He's going to take they're going to work the fields. They're going to do the harvest. Well, we know that's, the Jews did avodat hasadeh, the work of the fields when they were oppressed in Egypt. He's going to take your daughters. Well, we know that Pharaoh, when Avram and Sarah had to go down to Egypt during the famine, right? Pharaoh took Sarah, right? Like that's what Pharaoh does. He takes the women that he wants. And then, of course, he's going to take your lands. Well, we know that when there's famine in Egypt, when Yosef is Mishneh Lamelech, when he's second in charge to the king, Yosef actually, on behalf of Pharaoh, sets up a whole plan that enables Pharaoh to do what? He acquires all the land of Egypt. And this, by the way, is actually a historical point. Historically, Pharaoh actually owned the land of Egypt, the exception being for the priests, right? The Egyptian priests who were sort of there to back up Pharaoh's authority, they also own land, but primarily it was owned by Pharaoh. So again, what we see here in the abuses of power are the way that Pharaoh operated within Egypt. And then again, we'll see this next verse here, verse 17. I'll just read it in Hebrew, right? Sonchem yaser, that your flocks he'll take a tenth of it, like a meiser. But here's the next key expression that we immediately can only think of one thing: va'atem tiyu lo la'avadim, right? Va'atem tiyu lo la'avadim. What is that king going to make out of you? Right? It's translated here as servants, but when we hear va'atem tiyu lo la'avadim, what do we think? Right? We think slaves. Right? So it's very clear in these verses, the abuses of power of the king, as I keep saying, are as much a reference to Pharaoh as they are to anything. And this is even confirmed here in the next verse, right? When you are being abused by the king, oppressed by the king, enslaved by the king, you're going to cry out on that day because of your king, whom you've chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day. Right. And of course, if we think about the enslavement in Egypt, right, the whole turning point at the beginning of the narrative is the Jewish people cry out, and God hears their cries and ultimately answers it by sending Moshe. Right here, though, where the Jewish people are essentially choosing to go back to Egypt, right? God is basically saying, this time you made your bed, now you got to lay in it, right? It's on you. You're going to cry out and you're going to suffer. I'm not just going to automatically free you. And of course, as it says, the people hear all of these warnings. Nonetheless, they say to Shmuel, give us the king, right? So we can be like all the other nations. And again, all the other nations, we know what that echoes in our ears, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So it seems clear to me that when the Torah is, again, concerned about the excesses of the king, the problematics of the king's power, right? It seems that there is a clear concern here. The Jewish king is going to become Paro. And again, just to reiterate, the king becomes an alternative to God. The king takes your sons for his chariots. The king is going to force you to work the earth. The king is going to take your women. The king is going to take your land, and the king is going to make you slaves, right? That is the narrative of Shi'abud Mitzrayim. That is the narrative of Pharaoh. And what is particularly important, and again, what sits at the heart of all of this, is the fact that the king is ultimately seen as an alternative to God, as a God-like figure. And never was that more true than in the context of Egypt, right? One of the fascinating things that Chazal, the rabbis, are deeply aware of, and the Torah as well, is that what makes Egypt, perhaps more than anything else, is the way in which Paro is conceived of as the God king, right? This is very important. In Mesopotamia, in Babylonia, or Mesopotamia at least, the king is appointed by God, a semi-divine-like figure, but still very different than Paro. Paro is the God king. Paro is God on earth, right? Paro is the absolute authority within Egypt because he is God on earth. And that is what, in many ways, makes Egypt basically the hell that it is, because it is a man who is walking around who everybody is treating as a god. And this is, again, not just, the rabbis are sensitive to this. Plenty of scholarship around Egypt. Egyptology is very, very sensitive to these dynamics, as we're going to see. And the Torah is sensitive that when you treat your king, your leader, as a god, right, it creates a fundamentally oppressive and hierarchical society, which can only end in profound human suffering. So I'll just note here, there's multiple examples of this in Chazal, but in Shemot Rabbah, it's already very, very clear the way in which the rabbis understand that Paro sees himself as a god. But it's already clear, as we're going to see in Yechezkel. Yechezkel makes reference to the Paro seeing himself as a god, as a figure of the pantheon, the Egyptian pantheon. But I'll just read for you. It says, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, the wicked Pharaoh boasts that he is a god. Right? Pharaoh thinks he is a god. God tells Moses, though, make Pharaoh realize that he is an insignificant being. Indeed, I will make you, Moses, appear as a god to him. Right? So again, part of the liberation narrative, Yetziat Mitzrayim, is getting not just Paro to recognize that God is God, right? The subtext is Paro recognizing, more importantly, that he's not a god. All right. And part of the way Paro is going to be humiliated is that Moshe is going to be so elevated. It's as if Moshe is a god in relation to Paro. The Midrash goes on. How do we know that Paro claimed to be divine? It is said, this is quoting from Yechezkel, my river is mine own, and I have made it for myself. Paro, this is like Paro speaking. Paro sees the Nile as if he created it. Because again, the Nile is an important part of the political and religious reality of Egypt. It is profoundly central. And Paro is this, again, divine authority, the center of sort of the Egyptian pantheon, right? His relationship to the Nile is as if he created it. He maintains it. Therefore, he will look at you and say, surely this one is God, meaning eventually Paro is going to have to say to Moses, you know what, you're like more of a God than I am. So it's the fact that Paro sees himself as a god and that Egyptian society treats Paro as a god that is in many ways the absolute source of all of Egypt's problems. And the challenge, as we're going to keep seeing, is that once you have a king, once you have any kind of sovereign political authority, you run the risk very quickly of that king, that president, that prime minister, that state being treated as a god. And that is always fundamentally the opening to all forms of, as I keep saying, hierarchy and oppression and abuses of power. And it happens almost like this. You're gonna see in modern political thought how we just can lose in a second how quickly this distinction is. And for the Torah, this is the ultimate distinction. Wherever the king is not God. And everything we have to do has to be to make sure that we don't lose sight of that, because it's so easy to lose sight of that. So what I'll just mention briefly here, I won't read it inside, is that there's a very excellent book it's titled Kingship and the Gods, about the ancient Near East, about both Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the status and role of the king within both of those societies. Both had a divine-like status, but in Egypt, Paro has a profoundly, even more elevated divine status. And part of the reason why the king in Egypt has such a divine status is that life in Egypt is different than elsewhere in the ancient Near East. The Torah is already aware of this. In Mesopotamia and in the land of Israel, to survive, society is dependent on the rain. In Egypt, society is dependent on the Nile and the fact that the Nile floods in the Nile Delta every year, right? And the reason those two things are so different from each other is that, again, I live in Israel. You're never quite sure how much rain there's going to be or when it's going to come. But when it comes to the Nile, it floods every year like clockwork. So basically what happens is that Egypt was a profoundly more stable economic and political situation because of the regular flooding of the Nile in ways that other societies in the ancient Near East are not, because they're so heavily dependent on rain. And in a society in which there's this sense of like stability, right? What happens is that Paro is looked at as the center of that stability. Paro is the one that sort of is seen as the God king who holds the harmony of Egyptian society together. And this is fundamental. I'll read here just the second paragraph. This was the fundamental concept of Egyptian kingship, that Paro is of divine essence, a god incarnate, and that this view can be traced back as far as texts and symbols take us. In Egypt, the community freed itself from fear and uncertainty by considering its ruler a god. It sacrificed all liberty for the sake of a never-changing integration of society and nature. Remember, Egyptian is built upon this romantic wholeness in which society goes through this cycle, but it always, like, again, is stable, right? Life and death, there's like, again, this constant circular stability that keeps reinforcing itself, and Paro is at the center of ensuring that in the Egyptian imagination. What's interesting is what the book notes is that Mesopotamia has also similar conceptions of the king's divine, but when you look at the way Mesopotamia conceives of its king, the king is seen as like the leader of the people, but never fully supplants the people. So what the book notes is in artistic depictions in Mesopotamia, you see the king and you see his army. You see the king and you see other people, right? Because again, the king is maybe above the people, but still like part of the people. In Egypt, the artistic depictions are fundamentally different. When it depicts, like, again, Egypt going to war, as it says here, the Egyptians represented a similar event in quite a different manner. The whole scene is dominated by Pharaoh, alone in his chariot, and he has fasten the reins around his waist to have both hands free for the fight. The gods are represented by the vulture Mut hovering above the king's head and recalling Assur. Assur was a god in Mesopotamia. But Paro stands less in need of assistance than the Assyrian. No enemy dares threaten him. Furthermore, no troops are conspicuous in battle. The acts of the king alone count. He is invincible, nay, insaleable, intangible. No man can hope to resist the divine ruler and survive. Meaning the way that Egypt imagines itself is just Paro. It's it. We don't even there's almost nothing else there. And not only does it imagine just Paro, Paro is this all-powerful authority. Even the pantheon of the gods are kind of like secondary to Paro. Paro is everything. Paro is the state, right? Like Paro is the society. Mesopotamia, there's still a sense in which the king is like leader of the people and the king needs the gods' help. But in Egypt, it's all about Paro. And the reason this is so significant is you can actually see this in the biblical narrative, right? When you look at Yetziat Mitzrayim, the whole Sefer Shemot, right? Do we know the name of anybody else in Egypt besides Paro? In the narrative? No, right? Like in the Yosef narrative, we have Potiphar, like we have other people, but in Shemot, it's just Paro. It's a little strange, especially if you look at, let's say, Megillat Esther, which is a book that isn't dramatically different. The people are also in exile, also assimilating, also kind of subjugated. But what's striking is in Esther, right? Like not only do we know Ahasuerus, not only do we know Haman, we know the names of like a million other like people within the government and the bureaucracy. So part of what I think this distinction gets at is that in Egypt, it's all about Pharaoh. He is the God king. He is the only thing that matters. Everything is subject to him and his authority. Everything is subsumed with him and his authority. There's no such thing as Paro abusing his authority, right? God can't abuse his authority. Whatever God does, God wants, right? God is just, right? God is legitimate, whatever God does, because it's God, right? The same is true for Pharaoh. And the reason this is significant is what it means is in Egypt, right? When Paro is the God king, when Paro is the center of everything, there is no oppression. There is no hierarchy. Even if you've got a society of slaves, because whatever Pharaoh does, that's just the way it has to be, right? The king is not just above the law. The king is the absolute monarch and source of the law. Whatever the king says, that's the way it is. That is what is just. That is what is right, right? So that kind of a conception of a society is profoundly problematic, because not only does it lead to evil and oppression, it leads, as we're going to see later on, to evil and oppression that is seen to be just, because that is what the king wants. That's what God wants, and that's just the way it has to be. So this all leads us to the sort of modern political of all this, which to understand the way that Pharaoh has a second life in modern political history is through Thomas Hobbes' famous work Leviathan. Right, so Thomas Hobbes is an English political philosopher, lives in the 16th, early 17th century. He lives through the British Civil Wars. He lives through a lot of political chaos and strife. And sort of coming out of that, he lives, again, through the wars between Catholics and Protestants, right? All sorts of things. And coming out of that in the 17th century, he devises the first major work of political thought that really tries to envision what a modern political society should look like. And the whole crux of the book is that authority has to be invested within the sovereign, right? There has to be somebody at the top who basically has power. and has perhaps even in Hobbes' mind, total power. So again, the reason I brought the picture here, this is the frontispiece of Leviathan. And you'll see in a moment that there's all sorts of important things, going on here. The reason this work is so significant, at least for us in this conversation, is because it so heavily draws on the Bible. It so heavily draws on the Torah to envision its political reality. So already, I'll just note, the very title of the book is making very clear biblical allusions, right? Because it is a reference to the biblical figure of Leviathan, right? And if you know anything about Leviathan, right, it's this figure that appears in a few random places, right? A sea serpent, some sort of very powerful animal creature that ultimately, on some level, kind of like fights with God, but is ultimately, subject to God. But the very title of the book of Leviathan is to invoke this idea of this very powerful figure, this all-powerful figure that's maybe not God, but still, a human being can't stand against Leviathan. Right. And for Hobbes, the image of Leviathan is the image of the sovereign, the king, we'll even say, who has like complete power. And for Hobbes, what's so important, why does he keep emphasizing again and again about the power of the king? Because he's seen in England how this society has almost tore itself apart through religious conflicts, through civil war. And he recognizes that without strong political authority, you run the risk of society basically falling into chaos. This is in many ways the fundamental presupposition of the book. And in his vision, he's one of the first to put forward what we call social contract, right? That people are willing to give up some of their power and autonomy, and they'll give it to somebody who can be in charge to preserve their own safety and security. But for our purposes, what we really have to understand, and this is what people don't always realize about the book, is that for Hobbes, the king, the monarch, the sovereign, is the source of both religious and political authority. Normally, we think about just political authority. Hobbes is very clear. They have to be the source of religious authority as well within the state. Right, so if you notice here, Leviathan, the monarch at the picture at the top, he's holding in his hand two things. One is a sword, which is supposed to be symbolizing political power. And in his other hand, he's got this scepter, which is meant to be a church scepter. It's supposed to represent ecclesiastical, like church authority. Right. And if you look down underneath the bottom half, or towards the bottom half, right, if you can see my pointer on the left-hand side, what you see here is a little castle. And what you see here on the right-hand side is actually a church. Right. So for Hobbes, the sovereign has to be the source of both political and religious authority. Because if those authorities are split, you run the risk of the king not having the power he needs to sort of operate and secure society in the way that it needs to be, right? If the church can act against the king, if the king can act against, then you run the risk of chaos. That was Hobbes' concern, and therefore we need this singular authority. And in many ways, what's important for us to realize is that modern notions of state sovereignty are to a large extent built on Hobbes. Right, we live in a world in which the only legitimate violence is basically owned by the state. Right, the state has the monopoly on violence. That's what Max Weber will say a couple hundred years later. Right, we as citizens can't take the law into our own hands. We can't have somebody try to hurt us so that we're going to go pick up our gun and go shoot them. Right, that would be an illegal act. Only the sovereignty has the authority, the legitimacy to use violence. So that becomes very important to us, because that's the way we keep society safe. But by investing all power, all authority, the entire use of violence in the hands of the sovereign, it also means that we're, running, great risks here. So I want to look at a chapter in Hobbes' Leviathan that says something very, very significant. Because when we think about states, what we have to realize is that they're not just these sort of neutral political entities, right? That we, under democracy, come together, choose a leader, create a state. It's for the people, by the people, right? That's not really what states are at their heart, which Hobbes understood, right? States are creating these structures where the people at the top have like basically total power. They may not use it, they may have some limitations, but really they have to have total power, right? In times of war or in times of emergency, basically the state can do whatever it wants. We give them total power, even in modern democracies, right? Like that's the way it works. Deep down, we know that if we have to, we'll give the government power to do whatever needs to be done. right? That's the way we think about modern states and sovereignty, and that's exactly what Hobbes said going back, 400 years ago. So here's how Hobbes describes it. He basically says here, and you have to sort of pardon his more pre-modern English, but he initially in this chapter describes the process of social contract. People give up their power to invest the sovereign with power. I'm not even going to read it. Just we kind of know this. He just says that everybody kind of gives up power to invest it solely in the sovereign. He says this is more than consent or concord. It is a real unity of them all in one and the same person. Right? That everybody is coming together and saying this guy is in charge, and the king basically embodies the whole body politic. Right? The king is not just a representative. The king is the embodiment of the whole political body. They represent it. They are it in a certain sense here. This unity of the body politic is invested in this singular person, and it's achieved by covenant of every man with every man. Right? This again is drawing on biblical thoughts of breeds of covenants. In such a manner as if every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man, or to this assembly or multitude, so united in one person is called a commonwealth, in Latin civitas, right? That everybody gets together and basically says, we're giving this guy the power, right? That's how social contract works. It's not exactly how covenant works, because again, in covenant, or you could say in the biblical covenant, we give that power to God, so to speak. Here it's being given to an earthly authority. And then the next line is the key line. He says, this is the generation of that great Leviathan. This is how we create the state, the sovereign, right? Everybody invests it with power. Or rather, to speak more reverently, right? What is Leviathan really, he calls it? Of that mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. So what Hobbes literally says here, which is striking, is that the sovereign has to be so powerful, it's as if they are a God, right? He calls them a mortal God, right? We Jews know what a mortal God is, by the way, right? It's an idol, right? It's Pharaoh, right? It's not, there's only one God, which is transcendent. There's no human God. There's no immanent God. There's no mortal God, right? To have a state or a sovereign or a king who's a mortal God is essentially to invest that in an idol. And the reason this is so significant is that what becomes clear when you look at Hobbes is his whole vision of state authority and sovereignty, which I said is what we all sort of imagine states have to be, is not necessarily modeled on the Jewish conception of the king. It is actually, some scholars make this claim, and I think it's a very accurate claim. Who does this really sound like, right? The person that has absolute authority, that's the mortal God, right? Sounds a lot like Pharaoh. And why also does it sound a lot like Pharaoh? Well, remember the title of the book is Leviathan. Remember I said Leviathan is like the sea serpent. Well, how did Pharaoh conceive of himself, right? If we actually look in the Torah, right, like in Yechezkel, what you will see is the king, at least in the way Yechezkel says it, is that Pharaoh basically sees himself as a Tanin, right? Tanin is not Leviathan, but very similar, right? Tanin is like a crocodile or some sort of powerful sea creature, right? It says here in Yechezkel chapter 29, God says through the prophets, speak and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. God is telling the prophet to speak out against Pharaoh, the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, that has said, my river is my own, and I have made it for myself, right? Paro thinks that is a God. He is a God. He thinks he is the great dragon of the Nile. He thinks that he has created Egypt and therefore has total power over it. So what some scholars claim, and I think this is correct, is that Leviathan of Hobbes is really a direct reference to Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh as the Tanin, as the great serpent, because the authority, the sovereign authority that Hobbes imagines is infinitely closer to Paro of Egypt than it is to the Jewish king. And part of the way we know this is one of the most explicit differences. And as much as Leviathan, the book, claims to be drawing on the Bible, the biggest difference between Leviathan and the Bible is not even so much about the king, but about the prophets. Because when you look at Sefer Shoftim and when you think about the Nevi'im in general, what is the role of the prophet vis-a-vis the king? Right? The whole point of the prophet is to be able to speak truth to power, to be able to say to the king, you have violated God's law. Right? The prophet is an authority that stands outside the king's authority. The prophet can challenge the king's authority. Right? It's radical, profoundly radical. That's what Moshe does. That's what later Natan, later prophets, Shmuel, other later prophets will do. And for Hobbes, such a thing is simply not allowed. Because as I said before, the king has to be the source of political and religious authority within the state, because you can't have alternative sovereigns. There's only one sovereign. That's the earthly king. That's the paro, right? And of course, Leviathan, what becomes very clear is that it opens the door to the king being a source of absolute power and absolute oppression, right? The way that modern states invest sovereignty in their leaders to such a degree that those leaders can use that power to oppress the people, even in democracies, this can happen, right? Is basically hinting at the way in which every state is sort of like in potential can become Egypt, right? It can happen easier and quicker than you think. And as much as the Jews themselves try to place limits on the power of the king, we see even how the Jewish kings can very easily turn into leviathans, into pharaohs, in all sorts of deeply, problematic ways. So here is going to be my modern political moment, right? So I live in Israel, and as you know, there's been a great debate about legal reform here in Israel. And what's so fascinating about the whole notion of legal reform is it gets at everything we've been talking about up until now, which is the question of what are the limits on the authority of the sovereign. And basically, again, without getting into all the details of it, and we can have debates about what each side really wants, but one side basically says, right, the limits on the power of the sovereign are too great. We have to do everything we can to take away those limits or minimize those limits. And the other side is saying, no, we have to preserve those limits on the authority of the sovereign. In this case, the limits being the Supreme Court. We don't have prophets today, but we do have a Supreme Court that basically says, right, even the state, even its leaders are not above the law. They're held, responsible to the law, right? And that check on power is absolutely necessary. So the reason I wanted to bring this picture is that the protesters were putting up this picture. This is Bibi as Paro, right? So it says, "Let my people go" underneath it. Right. So what's fascinating about this picture is that the American, the ADL actually wrote an article. I don't know if people saw this about this picture, basically saying that it was anti-Semitic. Right? It's anti-Semitic to depict Bibi as Paro because it made him, look like such a bad guy. And as soon as I saw this and knowing these issues, I couldn't help but laugh. Because on a certain level, what these protesters were getting at with this are the exact same dynamics that we have been looking at this whole time, right? That the concern is that the Jewish sovereign, the Jewish king, the Jewish authority with unchecked power becomes paro, right? So if we could argue whether or not they're correct, which side, politically is closer to the reality. But the use of this image, right, the idea that the Jewish king can become paro is exactly the problem that the Torah is concerned about, right? It's not an anti-Semitic move to say this, right? And one might say it's actually one of the most authentic Torah moves there is, because the Torah is so concerned with the Jewish king becoming a paro. So the last thing I'll say, because I'm pretty sure we have to finish in a couple minutes here, is I want to just flesh out a little bit more about these concerns of what happens when the king becomes a paro, right? And then again, for me, this is going back to this basic question of you can't go back to Egypt, right? And the concern of going back to Egypt is we can't let Israel become Egypt. So there's one of the very interesting early 20th century rabbinic thinkers, of Aaron Tamarat, who was not ambivalent towards Zionism, but a very, very insightful about political theory. And he was very carefully able to use the Torah to think political questions in, I think, very, very compelling ways. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of his essays, because he gets at a lot of these dynamics as well. And he makes a really, really important point. I've never seen anybody else make this point, and I think it's really profound. What he notes, and this is, I think, the first point, I think, is something we understand, but he says it in a sharp way. What he notes is that there's sort of two dimensions of human evil, two dimensions of human wickedness. One of them he calls sort of like natural evil, right? And natural evil for Rav Tamarat is the way in which our desires lead us astray, right? We end up doing things that are wrong, and we know they're wrong, even though they're prohibited, because we want to, and we just kind of can't help ourselves. And that kind of natural evil, on a certain level, the Torah can address, right? Because so much of the Torah is about trying to get us to deal with our Yetzer Hara, to, lay boundaries, get us recognize what's wrong, what's right, and try to get us to align with it. Natural evil, the Torah can help us deal with. However, there's another dimension of human evil that he refers to, I think, here as unnatural evil. And unnatural evil is far more pernicious than natural evil, because unnatural evil is the evil that we do that we actually think is good. Because what Rav Tamarat knows is that human beings are sophisticated enough and subversive enough to convince themselves that all sorts of horrific things are actually just and right? Like the natural evil is kind of like it's wrong and we know it's wrong. The unnatural evil are the things that we convince ourselves that are actually okay when they may be the worst things of all, right? We might call it ideological evil, right? The way we can become entrapped within ideological ways of thinking that lead us to think that the good is the bad is actually good. And what he says here, this is the radical part for me at least, is he says the Torah works for natural evil. Torah doesn't work for unnatural evil, right? You can be entrapped in ideology, and the Torah can't help you get out of that, right? That you can use your ideology to basically corrupt the Torah, right? You probably Chazal, Torah can be a sam chaim, sam mavet, a drug of life, a drug of death, right? The implication being that, like, if you are trapped with an ideological way of thinking, you can use the Torah for total evil, and that's a real problem, because if ideological evil is such that the Torah can't help us get out of it, then like what do we do? Because when we look at the 20th century, right, the great evils of human beings are not the things that we do that we know are wrong; it's the things that we think are right. But our ideologies have convinced us they're right when they're truly, truly evil. So what Rav Tamarat suggests is that the whole reason that the Torah is given only after the Jewish people have been enslaved in Egypt and leave Egypt is because they need to know what ideological evil looks like. And you know what? What Egypt is pure ideological evil, because it is a society in which the king is God. And a society in which the king is God, as I've said, can justify all kinds of dishonesty, evil, hierarchy, and oppression, right? And what the Jewish people had to do is they had to see what ideological evil looks like, only so that when they build a society with the Torah in the land of Israel, they can recognize how even the Torah itself can fall into that kind of ideological evil. I'll just read a little bit here. Second paragraph, he says, to prevent such abuses, the Blessed One, Blessed Holy One, gave the Torah only after the exile and redemption from servitude to Pharaoh in Egypt. For servitude, the condition of having dominion over the person of another falls under the second category of evil, that unnatural evil, that ideological evil, that evil which pretends some justification. The only way you can imagine a society in which people can own other people is a society which ideology has said that evil is good, right? There's no other way to make sense of it. Unlike the man in the forest who ambushes another out of anger or lust, acting from natural compassion and evoking such sophistries, the master always makes claims that the slave, together with his possessions, was legally acquired just like any other object, that the land upon which the slave walks is the master's property. Right? In Egypt, that's what Paro does. Paro enslaves the Jewish people through the legitimate use of his authority, right? I'm the God King of Egypt. And slowly he takes control of them. Right? And he can do that, and nobody can question that. Pharaoh becomes God, and so had absolute justification to trample men mercilessly. For who, after all, can challenge God, right? Whatever God does is just. Therefore, when the Blessed Holy One wanted to guard the Torah against impostors, greedily seizing it to justify and excuse their persecuting and injuring and inflicting indignities upon other men, he chose to introduce his own severe retributions upon Egypt. Right, we had to see the ideological evil of Egypt, so we could recognize how the Jewish society could become that as well. That's why God says, "I am the God who took you out of Egypt, the land of slavery," and that's why we can't ever go back there again, or let the political societies that we create for ourselves in Israel or elsewhere become that as well. I know I went a little bit over probably, but I thank you for your time. And I will say this: Torah and politics, we don't necessarily mix so well in shul, but they fundamentally are always intertwined in life.